Imagine returning to the site of a disaster you had a hand in. If given the opportunity, many of us wouldn't. But in the back of the turtle, the protagonist, Gabriel, does indeed return and learns much about what can happen when you face your past. And so to talk about this, we welcome Thomas King. He is the author, most recently, of the novel, The Back of the Turtle. What a great pleasure to have you here. It's nice to meet you.
Thanks. Nice to be here.
We're going to spend the next half hour talking about this book, your fictionalized account of a disaster, essentially. And I want to start with the dedication, because it's interesting. You dedicate this book for the songs and the singers.
Yeah.
What is it? Who are these people?
There really are the people who helped me become a writer. They're the singers in native culture, the storytellers, the people who've kept those traditions alive for centuries. It was just my way of saying thank you for that, because those people, my father's people within the tribes, blood people, for instance, who were very kind to me when I was out in Alberta, they don't get a lot of recognition for having kept those traditions alive, kept those songs, and kept those stories alive. And you know, it's just a small acknowledgement for the kind of work that they do.
They're their inspiration and their teachings.
Yeah, they are. They are. The stories certainly are inspiring, both the stories I get from my father's side of the family and my mother's side of the family.
Okay, and I want to ask you, because you're wearing a turtle pin, and your book is called The Back of the Turtle. So remind people, because the turtle has great significance in Aboriginal culture. Just remind us of that.
Well, I'm Cherokee, and it's an Iroquoian language group, and within that group, one of the creation stories has to do with the earth writing on the back of the turtle. And I've always figured that if that turtle, if she could take care of the world, she certainly could look after me. And so I have turtle pins that I wear wherever I go, so that I'm hoping that my turtles will keep me out of trouble. And the book title, The Back of the Turtle, really is that reference to the world riding on the back of a turtle, a very fragile existence, as a matter of fact, because it could fall off, it could be destroyed easily enough. And we certainly do our best to do that. North Americans, just people in the world in general, we keep trying to destroy that planet where we live. It's kind of a goofy idea, but... Well,
it's not goofy. I mean, your book is about testing those sort of limits and the burden and the challenges of doing all this. And for people who haven't read it, I mean, it's about an Aboriginal scientist, that's the main character, who returns to his family's reserve in BC. Something, I don't want to give too much away.
No,
you know, something's not quite right. Where did this idea, this premise come from this book?
Well, I mean, the idea of disasters, human-created disasters, is not a new idea. You just have to turn on the news almost any day, and around the world you see some thing that's happened: an oil spill, a tanker run aground, fracking, the tar sands. You can go on and on and on. Coal mining. All of those things have been, energy extraction in general has been a very dirty business and very destructive environmentally. We keep forgetting what the coal industry was like back 80 years ago. We forget what Europe was like when they were burning nothing but coal, and the air was just black. And we forget that for all the promises of cleanups that companies swear they're going to do, when they're done with the energy extraction, for the most part that doesn't happen. And we're careless with all of that. And we just sort of put it out of our minds because we can. Our imagination and our memory is very short.
And given that, Thomas, and as you say, this stuff is nonfiction, exists on our news. And
I think it's nonfiction.
Yeah, but so then why fictionalize this account? I mean, where is that line for you? You could have done a nonfiction book.
I could have. I mean, I write nonfiction and I write fiction. I use the same strategies for both. Fiction gives me more latitude with character. It gives me more latitude with the actual events that I create for it. Nonfiction, I get hemmed in by the facts many times, and I don't like that particularly, or at least it limits me. So when I'm working in fiction, I have all sorts of room in which I can move, and I prefer that, to be honest with you.
And yet, through this fictionalized account, you are trying to reach out for larger truths, though.
Always. I mean, I don't see any reason to write either fiction or nonfiction unless you're trying to deal with something that's important to say. If you really don't approach literature in that way, where you have something important that you want to talk about, if you're just being entertaining, for me at least, that's not worth the time. It takes me much too long to write a book, just to simply write a book that's just basically entertaining. So I try to work in concerns about the environment, concerns about history, concerns about the way in which we conduct ourselves in the world. All those things are part and parcel of my writing package.
And in this book, I mean, you weave those things through 5 different characters. Some who I think instinctually I want to dislike, and yet you make me not like them.
We're talking about Dorian Asher. Yeah.
You like that. Why take that approach in telling the story through 5 different characters?
Well, because each one of those characters has a different perspective on the world that we're looking at, a different perspective on what's happened in that world. I mean, Dorian Asher, who is the CEO of my big nasty corporation, I could have made him a villainous villain, somebody who just is so, evil and mean that we would just, sit there hissing at each page that he appears on. But in actual fact, the villains in the world are not like that. They really are just like us, and they're somewhat likable. They may make bad decisions, they may make horrible decisions, but they're not the evildoers that we would like them to be. They're not like television villains.
Well, that would be
for the most
simplistic
part.
as well. If we
That'd be very simplistic, and and they're not very interesting. I mean, if you make them simplistic, then you don't care about them. Whereas I've got a good friend of mine who read the book and said, he says, I don't want to, but I really like Dorian. I feel sympathy for this son of a bitch.
Yeah. And the location, Samaritan Bay, fictionalized again.
Yeah.
Do you have, in your mind's eye, did you have a realistic location for that? What were you seeing?
Well, I'm from the coast originally, and so I always wanted to write a book about the coast. I started writing fiction about the Alberta prairies because I was out there for 10 years teaching at the University of Lethbridge, and that landscape captured my imagination. But I kept saying, come on, Tom, you know the coast just as well. Write a book about the coast, but I didn't do it. And then finally I had this one. I didn't have a specific location in mind. It was sort of a composite of coastal areas in Northern California, along the Oregon coast, and along the British Columbia coast. Everything from Eureka and Arcata, California, up through Brookings, Oregon, and into Tofino, and just below Tofino on Chesterman Beach, that whole strip on Vancouver
Because
Island.
you see a through line through all of those.
I do, and they just sort of come together. It's like a big pile of pieces of clay, and I just sort of jam them together and then work them around. But I have to create my own place because I needed to do certain things geographically. I need a kind of map in my head. Some fiction books have this nice little map that you see on the frontispiece, so you know where you are. I don't want to do that, but in my head there is that map when I create a fictional place.
Were you worried if you, I take your point about fiction gives you more latitude and more creativity. Maybe worried's the wrong word, but were you concerned if you did this in a, say, a historical fiction way or a non-fictionalized way, that you would just have to be too truthful to debatable facts about this story, about environmentalism, about energy?
Yeah, well, I mean, the joke about fiction and nonfiction is that they are much closer together than people like to think. When you talk about facts, you really are talking about agreed upon pieces of information that may not be facts at all. Certainly, I mean, the biggest example is the U.S. goes to war over weapons of mass destruction that are supposed to be in Iraq. They're not there, but they build the entire war program on that fact, which turns out not to be a fact in the end. So I don't trust facts as facts. I look at those as just parts of a story. Are they fictional? Are they truthful? Well, most truth is opinion to begin with, or at least it has that part of opinion. Yes, we can get a date for something that's signed, but in terms of what actually happened, for instance, if a dam collapses, let's say an earthen dam collapses out in Alberta, what's the story going to be? Was it sabotage? Was it neglect? Was it just the weather that did it? What's the facts of the matter? And you can debate those in the same way that you debate the facts in fiction. So I don't spend a lot of time, I mean, I look at the facts, but they don't hold me in place when I'm writing, whether I'm writing fiction or nonfiction.
And one of the things that's interesting in this book, sort of if we pull out the themes about energy extraction, things like that, when we hear about them in the news, often we hear like the company's name that is alleged to have been responsible or supposed to do the cleanup. Very rarely do we hear the individual person. I mean, I can think of Lac Mégantic, where we did sort of, the one guy was sort of, we all came to know his name. But this is an interesting exploration. I want to read a little bit because Gabriel quotes the Bhagavad Gita, and it says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of world," which is a reference, of course, to Oppenheimer's remarks following the detonation of the atomic bomb.
Right.
Usually, well, I want to ask you, I mean, to what extent do you, Thomas King, see a catastrophic event like an oil spill being the responsibility of a sole person, of one individual?
That's a good question, because you're quite right. When we talk about the spill in the Gulf, we're talking about BP. When we talk about the mercury poisoning in Grassy Narrows, we talk about the company that's responsible for that. And we have this notion that there's these corporations, these entities that are non-human kinds of things, but are treated as human beings, that are responsible for that. In actual fact, it's individual people who make those decisions. And sometimes they say, well, it's the board that made those decisions. But at some point, somebody says, let's do this. But by the time it runs down the line and you have the disaster and then it comes back again, all of a sudden there's nobody there. Nobody's standing on the line saying, yeah, that was my responsibility, but in actual fact it was. And so with The Back of the Turtle, I wanted to put someone like Dorian Asher front and center, so there's a face to that corporate malfeasance, so that Gabriel Quinn is not lost in that shuffle. That is that sort of that dance that leads to such a disaster. And it would behoove us to ask, when these things occur, who is responsible? Who is the individual, the one person who made that initial decision? Or even two or three people, perhaps.
The other point that's interesting in your book, and sort of how we treat this topic in real life versus, say, is that we often talk about, if there's a disaster, man-made or otherwise natural, we talk about how many people died, injury, we talk about property damage.
Property damage in particular.
Property damage, sure. How would you characterize, because this is again something that you explore in the book, the emotional and spiritual costs of a disaster to a community?
Well, the problem with measuring that is that it lasts for years afterwards. I mean, I'll just pick something that's not a natural disaster, the residential school experience for many Native people. That, the effects of that, the waves that came out of that are still rippling through Native society. It hasn't finished yet. And what happens with a disaster, for instance, the Exxon Valdez, we don't hear anything about how that coastline is doing, what the effect has been on the people who make their living from that area, both just emotionally and financially. That's been lost. You know, the thing ran aground, the oil was spilled, the environment there was destroyed, and then they got in with the hoses and cleaned it up, and then we are on to the next disaster. And that's shoved on the back page, and nobody cares about that now. And that's the way we operate in North America. It's a horrible kind of
And whose responsibility do you see that? Because I think you say part of it's the media, right?
Part of it's the media. The media, for the most part, does not do long-form journalism anymore. The media has turned into mini versions of something like CNN and Fox News, where you get these little blasts and you get them over and over and over and over again. I go to the gym and get on a machine and work out for 30 minutes, and I don't watch CNN, but I can see that out of the corner of my eye, and they just keep looping the same stuff over and over and over again, and then they find another disaster to loop over and over again. And I think what happens is we just simply say, okay, new disaster, big deal, you know, not going to spend a lot of time on it.
Well, and Dorian, if we stick with your character for a bit, I mean, his company's responsible for the spill, yet, yet he's cynical about public outrage over. He says at one point, North American norm didn't give a damn about the environment.
That's right.
You think it's a pretty popular point of view?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, you know, take beer off the menu at baseball games, and North American norm is up in arms. But anything that inconveniences us, that removes some of our comfort level, that's to be dealt with. But something that's sort of out there and is not us really that we're looking at. I mean, we're here in Ontario. If a major disaster happened in Alberta, how much time will we spend, you know, worrying about that? Well, the average person probably is not going to spend a whole lot of time at all. If it happens to us here in Ontario, then, you know, it's an immediate kind of thing. But yeah, I just don't think we have a long enough attention span, and I don't think that in general, while we talk a good fight, we're all that concerned with environmental issues.
And why do you think that is?
I don't know, because I know there are enough people, you know, David Suzuki has made his life trying to bring that idea front and center. Certainly I've talked about it in a much more minor way. I don't know why.
Well, might I suggest this, that maybe it's because the debate has become so polarized. You're either an environmentalist or you're big energy, big oil. And, you know, we talk, maybe I'll ask you this, chemical agent that Gabriel works on, it's meant to be beneficial to we people, but it ends up causing this tragedy. And it raises the issue that we deal with all the time, which is what is the right balance between development and the environment? And I would suggest that sometimes that we're just so polarized in this debate that we don't talk enough about balance.
Well, we certainly get ourselves into the situation where we say we want a clean environment, but we have to have jobs. We want a clean environment, but we don't want to reduce our standard of living. We want a clean environment, but we don't want to go backwards in terms of what our kids can expect to get. We have this forward-facing idea that things with each generation is going to get better and better and better. And quite frankly, at some point, we're going to run into a wall. We really are driving a car down the freeway at 120 kilometers an hour, and there's a brick wall up there, and we can see it ahead. And you would think that we'd slow down for it, but we don't. And we'll run headlong into it, and then we'll bitch and moan and groan about, why didn't somebody tell us that was happening? Or, how could this happen to us? We are the chosen people on the planet. North Americans are the chosen people. We have all these goodies. We have cell phones, we have television, we have cars. We live way above our means. We consume more than anybody else in the world. And we plan to keep on doing it. And the real tragedy is that we've begun to export those ideas to other countries. And so rather than rein us in, we seem to be duplicating ourselves like kind of a mutant gene, if you will.
And so if as you suggest, we're heading towards this brick wall, on the road to that brick wall, do we just have to get used to things like Samaritan's Bay, that this is just one after another?
We are used to it. We're used to it. We really don't pay a lot of attention to it. I mean, we get upset when what is it, Horizon? The Gulf spill. What the blazes was it called? Anyway, when the oil rig blew out in the Gulf and spilled all that oil, we were horrified, just horrified. What are we now? Is it still leaking into the Gulf? I don't know. What's the damage, the continuing damage down there, both to livelihoods, both to people's emotional health, to the environment? I don't know. Nobody covers it. Nobody cares about it because, okay, that's a disaster that's out of the way. We took care of that, didn't we? And on to the next disaster. We're always apologetic about it. You know, the companies are always sorry, 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 sorry. But it keeps happening. And after a while, you have to believe that corporate North America really doesn't care, that they have this fund, as it were, that can cover these kinds of disasters if they come along. And if they don't, then that's money in the bank.
Deepwater Horizons.
Deepwater Horizon.
There you go.
Thank you. Yeah.
That's okay. You know, I don't want to give people the wrong impression. This book is not Angry Thomas K.
No,
There's lots of
no.
humor. There's optimism. There is hope. So extrapolate for me. Are you optimistic that communities can rebuild after a disaster in all the ways, not just physically rebuilding?
Yeah, I want to believe that. I tend to be a pessimist, okay? And my way of dealing with most of my fictional nonsense is to handle it through satire. It allows me to have some humor, but with a sharp edge to it. I'm a pessimist. I don't know that I believe that we're going to recover from this, but I would like to think that we can. So I think of myself as a hopeful pessimist. I wake up every morning knowing that my writing isn't going to change a damn thing, but I still go to my desk and start to write in the hopes that it will. And that's the best I can do.
It's maybe your coping mechanism with your pessimism.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've got an espresso machine at the house, so I have a little espresso and sort of get my heart going, and then I go to my writing, and I hope that something will come out of that.
Well, let's pick up where we started, which was talking about the stories that you were told,
Right.
and the inspiration that they gave you. What role do disasters play in bringing your themes of your book? Plays a foundation for creating myths and stories?
Not too much. I mean, most of the traditional stories I know don't revolve around disasters. Disasters are really a contemporary North American creation that has become part of my my storytelling quiver, if you will. Most of the traditional stories I know are about relationships, and many of the stories that I really like are cautionary tales, coyote stories, for instance, which really are talking about your conduct in the world, how one should conduct themselves. So when you hear a coyote story, generally coyote is doing something that you really shouldn't be doing. So he's an object case. You know, don't do what coyote does, because it's not something that's good for the health of the community. So I try to bring in those more traditional elements into my contemporary fiction.
And just to round out our conversation for the day, Thomas, I mean, I know I've heard this about you, that you don't write to tell people what to think, that you don't want to deliberately tell me what to think before reading your book.
That's right.
But you do want to send a message, I'm assuming, with this book. What do you want us to take away?
What I want to do is I want to create a story that I can send out into the world that I hope will create some change. But once the book leaves my hands, it's no longer my book. And I learned very early on in my writing career that I have no control over my prose once it's out there. I control it until the time that the book is published and it gets out. And after that, I just step away. It's sort of like raising a kid. You know, you do the best job you can. You send them out the door and you say, you know, have a nice life, send me a postcard, you know, call every so often. Don't forget my birthday. But really, it's what people think of my writing. I can't control that.
Maybe not about your writing, but if we use your analogy, that when you send your kids out into the world, you still worry about them all the time. So if you're trying to send a message to this, do you worry about what that message might turn into?
Well, I worry that someone might misinterpret what I was trying to do. But what I was trying to do is no longer the issue once that book is out there. I try to write as well as I can, so that, I mean, if I'm saying, hey, look, we're screwing the world up, and we need to pull back and take a deep breath and try to redefine ourselves and our relationships with the planet. You know, certainly in this book, that's one of the issues. I'd like to think that people would read that and say, oh, wow, you know, maybe I should think about, you know, living my life a little differently. Then great. But there's an equal chance that somebody looks at that and says, wow, you know, that corporate guy is really a good character. I really like him, you know. I can see corporate North America being the salvation for the planet. And I could sit there and scratch my head and say, what are you thinking? But, you know, that's what happens.
Well,
with
I have
books.
to say, the thing I most enjoyed about this was we put a human face on sort of characters and prototypes that we have, and we sometimes forget that people, when we talk about these disasters and how they sort of foment and happen, that there are real people behind this.
Yeah.
We'll talk more tomorrow. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.